Hello, everyone. My name is TJ Billard, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. And it is my great honor to welcome you all to the second event in the Center's Distinguished Lecture Series for 2022. And events in this series will feature fellows from the Center discussing their own original research with a broad audience of scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and interested laypersons. And all of these events will, just like this one, be virtual, free to attend, and open to the public. And at the end of today's event, I will be announcing the next speaker in our series, so make sure to stay until the end for that. Now, without further ado, let's get to today's wonderful event, celebrating the launch of Florence Ashley's new book, Banning Transgender Conversion Practices, a Legal and Policy Analysis, out now with the University of British Columbia Press. Here was where I would hold it up if I had one, but I have an ebook copy, so I can't, but please be sure to get it. Today's event will be a little bit different than the standard lecture. Florence will provide a general talk about their book, and then we'll pivot to a conversation between Florence and today's moderator, Dr. Kelley Winters. So to get us started, I will introduce Dr. Winters, who will then introduce Florence. Now, most of you will already be familiar with Dr. Winters and her incredible work, but a formal introduction is always nice. Kelley Winters is a transgender rights activist, best known for her work combating the pathologization of transgender and gender variant people, and in particular for advocating for changes in the diagnosis of gender identity disorder. She is a founder of GID Reform Advocates and author of the 2008 book, Gender Madness in American Psychiatry, Essays from the Struggle for Dignity. Her influential writing has been published and presented widely across the field of psychology and the study of human sexuality, and she has served on the advisory boards of the Matthew Shepard Foundation and Trans Youth Family Advocates. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Winters. Dr. Winters, the room is yours.
Well, thank you so very much. I am just so honored to be here with you today. So I'd like to introduce Flo, and hang on to your butts, folks, because this is going to take a little while just to talk a little bit about what they've accomplished in a short time, more than I will ever live long enough to think about. Florence Ashley is a trans feminine jurist and bioethicist based in Toronto, Ontario. They have a Juris Doctor and a Bachelor of Civil Law from McGill University, a Master of Laws in Bioethics, and is currently completing a Doctor of Juridical Science at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law and Joint Center for Bioethics. I had to look up how to pronounce juridical because I guess my U.S. biased brain just said judicial when I heard it, but I looked it up, and it won't let me. Yeah, here we go.
Juridical.
So you know, it's magic. It's almost like a social contagion that good pronunciation can be spread on the web. Their research is supported by a SSHRC Joseph Armand Bombardier doctoral scholarship and examines the role of science within the legal system to both bolster and undermine trans youth autonomy. Flo served as clerk to Justice Sheila Martin of the Canada Supreme Court as the first openly trans feminine person to clerk at the highest court. In my view, Florence is the most prolific and impactful young scholar on trans health issues today, and I am honored to be here at the introduction of what I think is the most important book of the year, perhaps several years, on the critically timely subject of protecting our youth and communities from harmful transgender conversion practices. Flo?
Thank you. That's very kind and also far too complimentary. But I do hope that the book will, have a little bit of an impact. So I think I'll begin by talking about the book. But first, I want to mention I'm talking to you from a place known as Toronto, which is a territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. It's subject to the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and is part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and that has incorporated newcomers over time. And in particular, as a white settler, I'm coming through it through the 1764 Treaty of Fort Niagara. And the treaty was designed to create peaceful hunting conditions for nations that are living in close proximity, and the land was meant to be shared and used in common as family members that ate from one dish, hence the name dish with one spoon territory. Unfortunately, settlers did not respect the treaty, and colonial forces unilaterally appropriated the territory, a violent dispossession of the First Nations of this land that continues today. And I particularly want to call on my current university, University of Toronto, and McGill University to divest from fossil fuels that are ravaging the planet and financially commit themselves to address the underrepresentation of Indigenous students and scholars in higher education. Also call on the Quebec, Ontario, and Canadian governments to recognize and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and follow all of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because reconciliation cannot begin until we dismantle the settler colonial state. Now, in terms of my book, I also wanted to extend special thanks to Erica Muse, Say Sullivan, Matt Ashcroft, and Carl Bryant, who are absolutely wonderful human beings and survivors of conversion practices who have really taught me so much. And I particularly want to thank them for their insight and their brilliance and their encouragement and their support through the writing of this book. Really wouldn't have been the same without them. Now, you know, coming to the book, the first thing I kind of had to do with the book is to define transconversion practices. And so this is, so I want to give you the kind of the definition I landed on, which is transconversion practices refer to sustained efforts to promote gender identities that are aligned with the person's sex assigned at birth and or discourage behaviors associated with a gender other than the person's sex assigned at birth. And the way we see it, there's really a constellation of different practices. Some of them are targeting adults, some of them are targeting youth, some of them are targeting people who have a very clear and consistently affirmed gender identity and they're trying to change it. Other times they're trying to tell them, oh, that's okay with your identity, but you should never transition. They're sort of like, you know, hate the sin, love the sinner kind of logic. On the other hand, you have things that are more like the corrective approach that's used at CAMH, which was a big part of the focus of my book because and actually why I wear these. So you might have heard earlier, I wear dinosaur because much of my book is about the Jurassic Clark. And the Jurassic Clark, or as it's now known as CAMH, is an institution in Toronto that ran sort of like the biggest gender identity clinics in Canada. And in 2015, they closed the children and youth one amidst allegations that they were engaging in conversion practices on youth. And you know, this is the clinic that had people like Susan Bradley, Kenneth Zucker involved there. And that was already on the heels of a controversy around the adult clinic, which had people like Ray Blanchard. So really, they don't exactly have a good track record in this regard. And one of the things that came out is, well, when the clinic was closed, one of the controversies was around, well, whether what they did was a form of conversion practices, and those who were at the clinic denied it. And so much of my book, well, I mean much, parts of my book are dedicated to that question. Is it conversion practices? So this is what I termed like the corrective approach, and I do conclude that it is conversion practices. But let me explain first, you know, what it is, because it's really something that's been picked up a lot in, you know, all over in the new anti-trans movements. A lot of the logic from the corrective approach, and the idea was to to prevent or discourage pre-pubertal youth, especially, from growing up to be transgender. That's usually done through things like play therapy, or what they call interventions in a naturalistic environment, which is code word for saying we're too chicken to do it ourselves, so we're forcing parents to do conversion practices for us under our guidance. And their kind of stated goal was this idea of a prevention of transsexualism in adulthood and making the child comfortable in their own skin and natal sex. And Tay Meadow really summarized that view really well, saying, these people believe that short of psychologically damaging treatment, children should be encouraged to avoid transition if at all possible. And here, what's interesting is just how narrow and kind of borderline diluted the idea of psychologically damaging treatment is, because a lot of people would say that their work was precisely the kind of psychologically damaging treatment that should be done. But even then, this logic of like, we must do anything possible to prevent people from being trans is really at the heart of this practice. And if we're looking backwards historically, it's tied in the work that was being done in UCLA, at the UCLA Gender Clinic, with people like George Reckers, Ole Varlovas, and Richard Green. And the work of CAMH sort of disagreed with the Reckers approach on kind of 2 points. The first one was, well, they didn't believe that you should prevent kids from growing up gay anymore. At least it wasn't like their primary concern. They were kind of sort of like ambiguous, if not ambivalent, as to whether they should accept that when it's the parents' goal, but generally speaking, they didn't like make it their own goal. But it's still very similar idea that like, if you have a gender non-conforming kid, like sufficiently gender non-conforming kids are at risk of growing up to be gay, or even worse, trans. And later on, clinics like CAMH kind of remove the goal of preventing kids from growing up gay, but kept the goal of preventing kids from growing up trans. And much of that evolution around, we're talking about like early 90s, but then much of that logic, that kind of clinical logic, has stayed more or less the same since then. And we're talking, like over 25 years now. So that's kind of the first disagreement. The other one is that people like George Reckers and Yuval Lovas were very behaviorists. So they're talking from a very like Skinner paradigm, where you do a token economy and you use kind of what they call aversive, so to discourage people from being trans, or in their case being gay. But people like the CAMH clinic thought that, well, that's not good enough because it doesn't fully alter internal gender schemas, I don't know how to pronounce words, and that children could, in the absence of external cues and incentives, revert to their cross-gender behavioral preferences. So that's the language that's being used. So this idea was that, oh, we're not doing like Reckers and Lovas, primarily because they're too superficial, and that doesn't work. We need to go deeper in the child's psyche. And well, as far as I'm concerned, neither of those are a particularly good thing. And also working deeper in the child's psyche might be even worse in terms of teaching them that it's wrong to be themselves. But there's an interesting point of relationship here, which is, I'll be welcoming questions about later on. But Ole Varlovas is particularly well known, not for his work on conversion practices, but for inventing applied behavioral analysis, ABA, which continues to be the dominant paradigm for quote unquote treating autistic youth. And it's a paradigm that autistic adults have spoken out against a lot, saying that it's abusive, it's kind of autistic conversion practices. And yet, just as the Canadian government is banning conversion practices, which is a good thing, but it turns around and with the other hand is exclusively funding ABA and pushing more and more money into doing essentially conversion therapy for autistic youth. And we're talking about the same logic. It's the same guy that kind of invented both of them. I mean, of course, there's different paradigms for conversion practices, but still one of the dominant paradigms of conversion practices was invented by the same guy that invented ABA. And I think that really speaks to sort of a tension in a lot of kind of progressive governments in how they approach these problems. Now, more recently, we've seen Ole Ivar Lovaas. Recently, we've started hearing about another kind of different paradigm, or a supposedly different paradigm, which is gender exploratory therapy. And it says basically, oh, we're not actually preventing people from being trans. We're just kind of like, we're just kind of like making helping them explore their gender to make sure that they're really trans and it's not trauma underneath it and things like that. And to an extent, it's very fascinating, and I have a paper that hopefully going to come out soon on that, but it's very fascinating to see how it maps onto the sort of rhetorical tricks that people like George Reckers did to attempt to evade critique, saying, oh, we're not actually doing conversion therapy because we're not actually trying to prevent youth from being gay. What we're doing actually is that these kids are too rigid about gender, and we want them to be more gender neutral, but their conception of gender neutrality was essentially gender conforming. They wanted gender conforming kids. And that was, one of the ways in which they kind of tried to circumvent critiques. And then you also have a similar move by people like Joseph Nicolosi Sr. and Joseph Nicolosi Jr., who really equivocated, saying, well, no, we're not actually trying to change people's sexual orientation. We're actually trying to help them explore and heal their underlying trauma that just so happens to be the root of their sexuality, because we don't believe that people can just be gay. And that's really damn similar to gender exploratory therapy, where they're like, well, most, if not nearly all, trans kids actually believe that they're trans because of trauma, and so we're going to put them through this exploratory therapy to help them develop, to help them, develop an understanding of why they're trans and how it's rooted in trauma and things like that. At some point, yes, there is a distinction between gatekeeping and conversion practices, but when you're looking at things like gender exploratory therapy, it's delving way more into conversion practices territory. And to an extent, you're getting to a point where it's just like a distinction without a difference, you're making such fine nuances, like, oh, we're not actually changing someone's gender identity, we're just addressing the trauma that we believe lies at the root of everybody's gender identity. And we're just like, okay, well, that's just another fancy way of saying you're trying to change people's gender identity. So that's kind of it for the kind of definitional part that I wanted to talk about. And also, I haven't been keeping track of time, so I should probably look at it. Okay. Where did I put that? Okay, yes. So as part of my book, one of the things that I do is that I offer a model law to do a better job at banning conversion practices. And the first thing that I think I do that's different from what's been done is I question the logic, the kind of philosophy that underpins how we're writing these bans, because much of the bans that have been written so far, their logic is you point at that thing, you say no, and that's kind of it. I'm thinking differently, because I don't think that actually works. And that's one of the things that we learned with what happened in Ontario in the CAMH closure, is that people to whom the law very plausibly, arguably applies to, think that it doesn't apply to them. They say, oh, no, that doesn't apply to me. And there's a psychological process behind that that I talk about more in the book, but for our purposes, all we need to keep in mind is that people to whom it applies to just say it doesn't apply to them, a lot of time out of kind of like genuinely thinking doesn't apply to them, because they interpret the law in a self-serving way. There's a confirmation bias at play. And so what we need is to have laws that think less in the will we be able to, go after a person afterwards, but more, how do we prevent conversion practices from happening in the first place? And part of that is by using laws as messages, as communication strategies. TJ is going to love that. This idea of having a law that's very, very detailed and very, very clear, so that any survivor, any professional, any parent, and pretty much any member of the public can just look at the law and go like, oh yeah, this approach is totally conversion practices. Look, it's this bullet point here. Like, this is the thing, this is about trying to it's all predicated on the assumption that social or medical transition is undesirable and should be avoided at all costs. So you can just kind of look at that level and be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's conversion practices. So wanting to approach laws as really a sort of like pedagogical tool in which people are able to hold others accountable, know what their rights are, and have also professionals hold each other accountable, because we do know, and especially for trans people, a very large percentage of people who engage in conversion practices are licensed professionals. We had a recent paper came out led by Martin Blais at UQAM, and we found that around half, a little bit over half of trans people had experienced, of those who had experienced conversion practices, had experienced them from a healthcare professional. And if we add other licensed professionals that aren't like particularly healthcare professionals, like more generally like counselors, teachers, and things like that, we're talking about over 2/3. So this is a lot of people who are in these professional relationships, in these peer relationships that can, where they can be held accountable by their peers, by their colleagues, but often aren't, because their colleagues don't know enough. And so by having a law that's very, very clear and very detailed, you can kind of help nudge them along and provide a little bit more material for them to work. Then there's another thing that I do is try to have multiple avenues of enforcement and that are specifically non-criminal. The first bit is I really don't believe in criminal laws. I don't believe in a carceral system. I don't think sending people to prison is really the solution for anything. And so to me, it's really important that the bills be non-criminal, but there's also another reasoning beyond that, which is the criminal law is extremely disempowering to survivors specifically, because you're putting all the power in the hands of cops, prosecutors, who can guide the system, who can force you to come testify, force other people to go testify, and they're the ones who decide who's charged with it, not you, which means perhaps they'll be charging, somebody who, especially, in the more faith-based context, where a lot of people who engage in conversion practices are themselves survivors, and you kind of have a spectrum of that goes from youth being, victimized and being forced into conversion practices to youth being sort of manipulated into contributing to that environment. And we saw that a lot with like the ex-gay movement, to all the way to someone who is a survivor but now is very actively offering conversion practices. And that's a long spectrum, and I think we can generally agree that you want to go after the one that's just like straight up offering it at the sort of top of the hierarchy. But lower down the hierarchy, where exactly we want to draw the line is not, I think, something we should be leaving to cops. It's something I think we should be leaving to survivors to figure out based on their own experiences. And that's where a more a non-criminal system can really help work. So you can have directly lawsuits, but then you also need to think about, well, okay, but what about legal aid? You know, there needs to be legal aid coverage. You also need to make sure that the law can you can pursue a claim through like a human rights tribunal and human rights commission, because commissions often have investigative powers and have come with, you know, a lot of sort of institutional power that can help you along with the process. So really important to have these different angles, I think, as part of the law. And then as a last little bit before we go into a back and forth is I want to talk a little bit about, you know, what it's like to be a scholar during the rise of fascism and, you know, its attacks on trans communities. And the first one is, holy shit, this is hard. We're all on the end of our rope. We're all running on fumes. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because I know everybody in the chat right now is probably also running on fumes, also struggling just like me. And I want to say, yeah, me too. It's really hard right now. Like, you shouldn't feel bad. You shouldn't feel like there's something wrong with you, that you're struggling to just, you know, keep up right now. Like, there's just so much going on. It's a really toxic atmosphere and environment we find ourselves in. As a scholar, I've from the beginning sort of tended to be much more pragmatic. Namely, I go problem first. I find a problem in need of a solution that I think it can contribute to, and that I think will can, you know, materially help improve the lives of people as little as one can with scholarship, because, well, my second point is skepticism, but really having this pragmatic philosophy of like, I'm approaching scholarship to help people, not to do scholarship. And you know, we all have our moments where we need to, you know, take something that's perhaps a little bit more abstract and work on that so we can like catch an emotional break. But overall, and that's how I picked, you know, this project that turned into a book, is I asked myself, look, I have skills. What's an issue that I can put these skills towards, that I can like get a book, drop it on someone's desk, and have helped a little bit. Because ultimately my hope for the book is this. Will it change the world? Probably not. Definitely won't. Would I like that? Well, certainly. I don't think it will, though. But you know, if there's one person somewhere that doesn't experience conversion practices because of my book, it will have been a resounding success, because it was really hard to write this, but it's still way less hard than it is for anybody to go through conversion practices. And that's my thinking here, is for all the sweat and tear that went into this book, if I can save one person from the horrors of conversion practices, will have been beyond worth it. And I would do it again any day. But then the second point, which is, when we're a scholar, I think we need to be skeptical about the impact of our own work, because it's just too easy to rest on our laurels and think that our work will have an impact. And I have hopes for my book, but I don't have expectations, because I don't know if my work is actually making things better. And I think it's healthy to have doubt about that, because so much of academia is this neoliberal lie that if we work within this system, we're gonna enact all the changes that we need. And I think it's a lie that's being, you know, perpetuated because, you know, late stage capitalism and the neoliberal government don't want us to actually affect change. And universities and scholarship is one of the ways in which they co-opt movements and take people who are very smart and could have an actual real impact on the world and put them in an environment where they can manage them and actually cut away a lot of their power. And so I think it's really important to also wonder, will our work really have that impact? And I don't know. I hope so. And writing the book was hard. And throughout, I thought so many times about, Ruth Pierce's article, Methodology of the Marginalized, because, you're writing this book, hearing so many stories from people firsthand, and you're seeing people, you're losing people to suicide left and right, and you're fighting on one front and against some oppressive bill, and the moment it starts, calming down, there's another fire to put out. It's, really taxing. And this experience was really weird because it's really kind of simultaneously lonely yet so rich in community, because I'm just in my room writing. Like this may look fancy because it's tangible, but like I wrote this in my underwear and probably naked most of the time, actually, because it was warm in the summer. I was in my room. It was very lonely. Yet at the same time, you have all that community around that, looks at the book, is so thrilled about it. Everybody in the room right now. And it's so, it's so inspiring and motivating to see people react to your work and be like, oh, this, I really like this. So that was a very interesting but also confusing experience. And there was also I think a lot of one thing I thought a lot was, navigating this really insider-outsider dichotomy, because writing this, I'm partly an insider insofar as, I'm trans. I am impacted indirectly by conversion practices because I had to learn to navigate to avoid them. I'm constantly fighting with people who want people that are like me not to exist. And I also see the ravages indirectly through my community, who are people that I rely on to just survive a lot of the time. Yet I didn't experience conversion practices. I'm an outsider to this topic in very significant ways. And so I had to learn to navigate this kind of duality, because it's really important for me to be able to translate the voices of survivors. And now I'm not doing, empirical research, so I'm not, interviewing survivors and citing them, but it was really important to me to have a book that can feel like it's carrying their voice, and that feels like it's, it's not something that's being imposed from the outside onto them by some disconnected scholar that they are not in community with. And so that's something I also wanted to always keep in mind. You have this tendency, I think, in trans studies especially, to homogenize trans communities, to think of trans communities as kind of a big block, as though we don't have so much granularity and heterogeneity in our experiences. And that often leads people to kind of overextend beyond their experiences, beyond what they've learned in their community. And that was something that was really important to me. And, I hope that I've done justice to survivors with this book. But that's also something that I think that I want to keep, stay critical of and always be thinking about, because it's too easy to think that you're a hotshot doing the best work ever. And when you start thinking that way, that's when you lose yourself. Erica Anderson not gonna name names. And so on this note, I think I'll close kind of my my monologuing part and delve into more conversational bit.
I'm going to disagree with the false equivalence in your last paragraph there. We're not going to go there. Thank you so much. You've basically covered, you know, the scope of a master's thesis in just a few minutes, and everybody's going to have to just kind of soak that in for a while I join you from unceded lands and islands surrounding the Santa Barbara Channel on the beautiful Central California coast that rightfully belong to the Chumash people. And I'll add that there is literally a jackhammer outside of my window. It's not my tummy growling. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. But I do apologize for the background noise. Just really quick, I want to acknowledge my friend and community pioneer Dallas Denny, who I believe was the first to coin the term Jurassic Clark in her blog some years ago, and it went viral through communities. And thank you, Flo, for keeping that alive, because it's meaningful, and human lives are at stake. Thank you for sharing your personal connection to the topic and the urgency of the topic of banning gender conversion practices at this particular point in history, when trans people are being scapegoated as a tactical part of a global rise in fascism that unfortunately my nation played a central role in sparking. I want to ask though another little personal question. Okay, not that personal, but you know, beyond the scope of academic scholarship, you have honed some really nuanced skills, communication skills, in being able to write for broader audiences than just just academic reviewers, and that's the other thing that makes, I think, this book so important and impactful. And so I just wanted to write, speaking as a wannabe writer and a logician, beyond the urgency of the life and death topics at hand. What has inspired your craft as a writer? Because obviously you take that seriously in addition to the other aspects of your scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much it was an inspiration as much as a skill building moment, but one of the single most influential thing in how I write today was and stay with me on that one, an international tax policy class that I took in law school, and the prof, love her to bits, but she was brutal. The way the course was structured is we'd read like recent articles, like either forthcoming or that recently came out on international tax law, and afterwards she'd bring the authors into the class to talk with us, give us a talk, and then kind of reflect. And our grading was we had to write 300-word critical commentaries on each of them. And 300 words on something that's like, like state of the art is brutal. And to make it more brutal, she would send it to them and they'd read it on the airplane ride over. And I remember the first ones when we received it back graded, I think the average was 30%. It was rough. And she would do this thing where she'd start reading and she'd like slash like unnecessary words like adjectives and things like that. And if you were too verbose, she would just like draw a line and say and write, I stopped reading here, and she'd grade the first portion as if you wrote nothing else. And holy shit, that was brutal. But by the end, I had really learned to be extremely concise. And let's face it, I'm not always this, I'm rarely that level of concise and succinct today, but I developed the skill to do it, and knowing how to do it makes it much easier to actually depart from that afterwards. So like basically know the rules so you can screw with them afterwards. And I think that was really, really influential. But then in terms of, what inspires me truly, it's you all. Like, it's people in the room right now. I mean, there's multiple people in the room right now that I know and that inspired me. It's the people that I, back in pre-pandemic days, and also back before I left Montreal, it's people that I'd see at the Aztec dinners. It's the people that I'd see at the Trans March, the people that we just hang out and have little community dinners at home with like a bunch of like activists and mixture of activists and many baby transes, because, well, you know how trans activism is. After 3 years, it's all, you've got an entirely new crowd of activists, and all of the ones that were there at the beginning are now, doing something else, or usually burnt out. But yeah, like that's where the inspiration lies. It's the very real people that are around me, and they're the ones that I'm thinking about when I'm writing.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Balancing conciseness with clarity and cogency is not easy. That's a fine art, and thank you for that story. I guess I want to dive into a topic that's, I think, particularly timely to me, that I've been writing about recently with extra urgency, and you introduced it a minute ago, talking about this whole gambit of selling coerced exploration psychotherapy, as a deception for what is actually a form of conversion. And I think this is historically urgent right now, because at the 2016 WPATH Symposium, the late Richard Green and Kenneth Zucker, names that are familiar with, I think, all of us on this call, were platformed by WPATH to present specific legal and mental health practice advice, we'll put scare quotes around advice, on circumventing prohibitions on gender conversion practices by labeling these as, direct quote, therapeutic gender exploration. This was starting in 2016. Zucker stated, and I kid you not, quote, "So I asked a lawyer the following." Obviously, that lawyer wasn't you, Flo. Zucker said, the bill says treatment, this is talking about the Ontario bill, cannot seek to change the gender identity of a patient under 18 years of age, but it is okay to engage in identity exploration. What's the difference? The lawyer, Zucker's continuing, the lawyer had a very detailed analysis. No one the fuck knows. So he actually, Zucker actually said that and put it on a slide at the 2016 WPATH Symposium. Green read from a manuscript of his 2017 Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry law article, which you cited in chapter 4. In this paper, Green stated, the identity exploration and development permitted in the recent legislation has not been tested and may be a gray area for exchange among therapists, minors, and parents. In other words, he's giving legal advice about using exploration terminology as to open a loophole. In a proposed and later canceled session for the 2017 U.S. Symposium the following year, Zucker repackaged his Jurassic Clark gender conversion approach as, quote, direct quote, the active exploration model. Active exploration. Consequently, the draft child and adolescent chapters of the WPATH Standards of Care version 8 are loaded with this language of gender exploration therapies and, quote, therapeutic exploration of gender diversity in contexts that open a disaffirming punitive treatment loophole, in my opinion. So when we get into the nitty gritty of model law, could you walk us through a little bit of how anti-conversion laws should be crafted and maybe evolve over time to protect trans and gender diverse people from a growing threat from this proliferating loophole tactic.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the problems is, what's the difference, right? What's the difference? Well, the difference is in the intention, right? And unfortunately, insofar as conversion practices are defined by their intention, it's going to be very difficult in a lot of cases to just look at a superficial practice and know if it's conversion practices. You're going to have to, look at what the provider says, what they say their goals are, how much that makes sense. That's an uncertainty. At the same time, look, it's an uncertainty that the law deals with all the time, right? Anytime you have to figure out intent, well, nobody is a mind reader, so you have to take context clues. In some cases, they're really kind to us insofar as they literally write it in peer-reviewed articles. In which case, it's very easy because you can read people saying, "Oh, we're trying to prevent kids from growing up trans." Well, that's your answer, But then, well, in terms of Richard Green and the loophole, well, okay, one thing that's very fun is that you basically can't defame someone who's dead. So Richard Green can fucking die. Well, actually, no, he's already dead. Oh, what can I say that's insulting to Richard Green? He can fucking fuck off. He can eat a fucking cactus whole with the entire spikes. And he's about as good at law as he was at trans care, which is to say dismal. Yeah, it's not, so it's a very thin reading of the loophole. He's doing a very bad reading, but I do think we can sort of circumvent that. The one that I do is the one I say is, well, you have to take reasonable steps to ensure that you're not trying to discourage someone's gender identity or expression. And what that does is that that imposes something concrete. So reasonable steps is a very legalese concept, but what's important to know is there's no clear list of what counts as a reasonable step to not be pressuring the person in that way. But what it does mean is that, first of all, there has to be something concrete. It can't just be oh, well, I felt like that was, no, you have to bring the receipts. And it also shifts the burden of justification legally. You have to show that you've taken reasonable steps. It's no longer the other person who has this whole burden of proving everything. Now you're the one who has the job of showing you took reasonable steps. And if you didn't actually start writing down stuff, and if you didn't keep good record keeping, you're not going to be able to show shit. So you better come ready for a fight if you're going to try to use these loopholes. So that's kind of the big thing. Another thing, though, is that to an extent, I think we also need to think about the ways in which, because the distinction between gatekeeping and conversion practice is often one of intention, and there is a very large spectrum of gatekeeping. We're just not going to get everything from a ban on conversion practices. We're going to have to rely on other types of laws, like what Spain has in terms of laws ensuring a whole host of rights in relation to gender affirming care. And that's the kind of stuff that's really necessary, because again, banning conversion practices is really important, but at some point, it only takes care of a certain subset of awful practices, and the range of really awful practices is so much broader than conversion practices. And at some point, we're going to need to have other laws that deals with those with those awful practices by weeding them out, by making sure that by making sure that access to gender affirming healthcare becomes sufficiently easy and smooth that the people who are doing the really awful gatekeeping and transphobic practices just are out of a job. And I think like that's kind of the hope. So in terms of how do you deal with loopholes, one, you close them, you tighten them, you make sure that the language is clear to really either entirely close it or at least make it as small as possible. And then the second step is, okay, what can we do beyond just bans on conversion practices, which I think is like a bigger discussion, but one that really that's really kind of interlinked.
That's awesome. Thank you so very much. We need TJ. Can we go a few minutes over, because we need an entire semester class for this discussion, not just an hour. This is just awesome.
We can go over in a second, but just before we do, let me let everyone know what our next upcoming event is in case they have to leave. So our next event in the Distinguished Lecture Series will be held on Wednesday, May 11th from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time, when we will hear from Senior Fellow Aniruddha Dutta, who will be delivering their lecture, Suturing and Disrupting the State, Indian Trans Activism in the Aftermath of COVID-19. So to register for that event, you can go to appliedtransstudies.org/events, and all the registration details will be there. So please, if you can join us next month, we would love to see you then.
Oh, that is awesome. Thank you. Just a quick closing question. I wish we had another couple hours just to talk about Chapter 3, where you analyze existing legislation in jurisdictions around the world. And that is just a real eye-opener, especially in places that I've called home, like New Mexico, which have significant shortcomings. But what advice, given the tools that you're putting in folks' hands in this book, what advice do you have for community members and allies who wish to be involved in banning conversion practices in their jurisdictions?
I should unmute. That usually works better. I would say, the first step to getting involved is to connect with survivors. There are almost certainly survivor groups in your area. If there aren't directly in your area, you might be able to connect with more international groups. I'm thinking notably the work being done by Outright International. There's on specifically trans conversion practices, I think a lot of amazing stuff being done by GATE. And so I would suggest really connect with survivors and really center them in those needs and start from there. I think it's really important to bring a lot of different knowledges and expertise, but also put them in the service of survivors. And I think that's really the first step. I mean, that's a lot of what I do in terms of pushing for bans. A lot of time I'm going back to people and going what do you want me to do? Because sometimes I also can't get what my favorite thing is, right? In Canada, I had a lot of personal feelings about the federal ban being proposed being criminal, because I don't believe in criminal law. But my stance was, I'm not here about me. I'm not centering my own feelings about that. If survivors are telling me to do this or that in relation to the ban, that's what I'm going to do, because I'm here to offer my expertise to them for them to use in the way that they want. And I think that's something that I stand by, and I think would do again today, even again if I don't believe in criminal laws. And I think sometimes that's difficult to do because our short timelines and you just get stuff kind of dropped on you, especially in the political world. But I think that's something that we should all aspire to in terms of how we do this work.
Well, Flo, thank you so very much, and thank you for the hard work and emotional labor that you put into this work. And I think it definitely will have an impact and make a difference. And good luck and Godspeed your finishing your dissertation and your future career. Thank you so much.
I'm trying, and also just so everybody knows before leaving, it really pains me to say this, but in terms of cost, I'm pretty sure Amazon is the cheapest way to get my book.
That is unfortunate, but you know, a dollar saved on this is a dollar you can spend fighting.
It's like $15 cheaper for the digital one. Like I wouldn't say this if it was a couple of bucks. It's like half the cost.
Oh, that is a lot. Okay. Well, thank you to both of you, Flo and Dr. Winters, for being here with us today and sharing all of your wisdom with us. And thank you to everybody who was able to attend today. We hope you can join us for future events, and we will see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.